Hi guys, Serratus here, welcome to 3D Mutiny. So today we're going to show you how to make a torso from a basic sphere, and I was just dabbling around with a couple of materials, and in testing it I started to test out doing a torso, and while I was sculpting it I thought it would be a really good opportunity to show you how you can start from a sphere for yourself. So today what we're basically going to go through is this entire process. So it doesn't have to be too intimidating with all the anatomy references that are out there. Primarily just going to sculpt it from my memory, and then as things pop up I'll show you why I make certain decisions. I think that's a really good way to embark some knowledge onto you for your own sort of sculpts. And if ever I feel like practicing, I also put a project into the projects list under the outliner. So I can press tab, open up this project, and then I can start sculpting from Dynamesh sphere. So for this material, I'll actually send it out to you guys. So go down in the welcome package, I'll put it all in there. So you can download this material and the setups that I use, the hotkeys, and some additional stuffs. So when I first start out, I usually make sure that I'm in a low Dynamesh. So something like 64, and then I activate the Dynamesh. Just means that we're focusing on the important things like the larger forms. It means we're refrained from doing any sorts of details. So on that note, the kind of brushes that I'll use for creating the body, I usually like to start on the silhouettes, so creating the main shapes. And a really good brush for that is the move brush. So with the move brush, I get a very large selection, hold space, and I can get this draw size up. Usually how I start it, I just drag something down, similar to how I would do with the face. And what this is creating is the bottom of the pelvis area. So if you think about this bottom side, it's going to be eventually turn into all the torso. So that's good enough. I'm not too worried about the proportions just yet. I just want to get landmarks in. And then once we get all those landmarks, we can budge them around. So often when I see students working on things, they're really meticulous about positioning, you know, the perfect pelvis distance. What are my references? Are the head units perfect? I'd say throw that out the window for the time being, just as you're practicing. So my kind of workflow, what I usually start with, I just like to flatten the front of the chest. So it's usually at a bit of an angle. And for that, I'll use a trim dynamic brush, BTD. What that's going to do is basically create the surface of the front of the chest. I'll tend to couple that up by just flattening the top, and then I know that the neck is going to go on top of this, and it just gives us a nice flat surface which will eventually turn into things like the clavicle. If you want a bit more proportion, what you can also do is just bring out some shoulder spheres. So you can add a sphere for yourself if you want to position it, or you can be a bit more artistic with it. So for example, like a clay, we can just do little circles like this, and what it's going to do is pull out some clay that we can work with. You know, at this stage you can smooth it over if it's a little bit too distracting or hard surface for you, but that's totally fine. And then again with the trim brush, I will just trim away anything that doesn't look right or is poking out. And so we're basically starting with the top and working our way down the torso. So as you're sculpting, what you usually find is something that looks kind of out of place, and then you would just naturally move on to that section. So for example, if we look at the back is obviously not hunchbacked like that. If you're studying, you can look at a couple of your own references, maybe from the side, just to familiarize yourself with that. But after a while of being an artist, you know obviously what the back looks like. So for this again, is just the trim dynamic. We can flatten that really harshly, or we could just use the move brush and then push it in. And what we're looking for is a flat back. If you imagine you put your back up against the wall or a door, it's going to lie flat, and sometimes you can pull your head all the way back as well. So it's a good way to think about where the body's positioned. So after this, what we can move on, I naturally want to put in a bit of a pelvis, and these are going to be good bony landmarks. Really good to get bony landmarks in early, because between the bony landmarks are where all our muscles are going to connect. So we don't have to do the full pelvis. Usually what I like to do is get something like a dam standard and then hold the Alt key, and then what we can do is create the top line of the pelvis and then use that to basically connect all our pieces. Because we're focusing on the torso, I'm not going to draw out all the legs, but when it does come to the legs, you can basically go on the other side and start to connect all the muscles there. So once we've got that pelvis, it actually gives us a nice little landmark to position. So for you guys, you would look at your references. For me, I'm just going to put in all the landmarks first and we can talk about it. At this stage, we can start to think about constructions. So might be handy just to put a little indication of a belly button there. Might vanish as we smooth things over, but it's good to have that little landmark. This one I want to start to bring out is actually the pectorals, because it's a very major part of the torso. So what I'm going to do is lead a line down the center and basically split it off like this, and then ring it underneath the armpit. And that's given the basis for our pectoral, and you'll see that it kind of wraps around, because we originally had a sphere, but this is nice because this pectoral is laying flat on top of a rib cage. So if you really want to look into it, you can see the breakdowns of a skeleton and where this green pectoral muscle is wrapping around it. So just make sure that it's going round and tucking underneath the armpit. So you can reinforce that with a couple of brush strokes. So say for example a brush like clay tubes, what I sometimes like to do is just brush in the direction of the muscle, So you can see the muscle fibers here. It doesn't have to be super accurate. All you want is the initial shape. So for example, here I'm going back over it, and as you can see, it's starting to round off that muscle, because muscles are usually like globular and convex. So you can combo that with a smooth. I'm not too worried about it. So just above the pectoral muscle, there's no rhyme or reason of what we're moving on to next, but you'll have this collarbone. So you can feel that on yourself. It's very hard, and lots of muscles are going to be connecting to it. It's how you shrug your shoulders, and also your back shoulder blades or your scapulas also move up. It's how you lift things above your head. But when it comes to sculpting on the surface, it's very present and it has a very particular shape. So what we can do is actually start to draw that in. So I'm not going to look at too many references. What I tend to do is just draw two of these little bumps. Those are going to be the front of the collarbone. And you're going to make this bow shape, and it's going to lead all the way back to what eventually is going to be our arm and our shoulder and our deltoid. So we haven't drawn that yet. So with this, what it's also nice to do is just go back over it with a damn standard brush. And then that means it's going to create a nice little shelf that we can start to cave into, because this area is very flat. Probably actually put your fingers in and you'll feel a lot of neck muscles and tendons, which we'll get around to. So on that note, usually what I like to do is just cave out this area. So what I'm masking here, that's going to go inwards. So with the clay brush, I'm just going to hold Alt and then go inwards. Also use a clay tubes. It's really good for like fleshing out that particular area. And at this point, it's probably worth thinking about putting in a neck, just so we can reproportion things. So for the neck, you can insert a cylinder, add another sub object and try and get it really accurate. But it's just as easy as you're sculpting, just to reinterpret it sort of artistically. So what we can do is hold Control. It's going to mask. The benefit of this is we can roughly estimate how thick the neck is going to be depending on the character. So take a look. Usually it's roughly going to be just before in between the nipples. Again, depends how built up the person is, how much muscles they have around their neck. We're going to go for all the muscles here. So press Control and then click on the canvas. That's basically going to invert it. What you can do is get to the move gizmo, and then with the green arrow we can actually pull this upwards. So that's almost like extrusion that you'd see in Blender or Maya. It's very, very useful. Now once that's in, I would just position this so it seats nicely with the torso. So for example, again, we don't really have that hunchback. We can either get rid of it with more trimming, so just trim that down so it fades nicely back into the neck, but also at the same time we can just fill in the muscle that's missing there. So if I approach it from the back, maybe we can get an image here. What we're going to be creating is the trapezius. There's this big kite-shaped muscle that I'm zooming in here, attached to a certain section of the scapula, which we can draw in. Fundamentally, it goes all the way to the top of the head, and it's going to create the front silhouette of the neck. The best way to do that is just interpret it. So with the basis, usually what I like to do is indicate where the bone's going to be. So depending on how pulled back the person's shoulders are, the scapulas are going to hide back into the body. Maybe if they're rounded over a bit, the scapulas are going to poke out. Usually what I like to do is get a damn standard, hold Alt, and I'm just going to estimate where the ends of the scapula are going to be. And so with those ends of the scapula, we also have the tops of the scapula. And this is just going to be a guidance system for me to be drawing these muscles. So again, with the muscle fibers, we were thinking we're going to brush in a particular direction and then basically build that up. How you get an understanding of how bulky that is, obviously you can have some human references off to the side or just do some major anatomy studies. So before we put this muscle in, the thing to note is that we might not have enough geometry at the top of the neck. With Dynamesh, as we extruded this out, I'm going to hold Control and draw a mask that's going to reassess everything. So with this, we're going to bridge the gap between the shoulder and the neck so we don't have this very digital right angle. So with that, simply, I'm going to use the clay tubes. The nice thing about clay tubes is going to almost act as a little bridge in between certain areas. So with this, I'm falling short just about halfway up the shoulder line. So I don't want to go anywhere further than this. I'm just going to brush down in the direction into the shoulder blade. So these muscles are really good, again, for stabilization above your head if you're ever lifting anything. It's what moves these scapulas around, which your arms are connected to. So with the back as well, and the same with the front of the torso, I like to get damn standard and then just draw a very straight line down the middle. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm usually quite wobbly with it because it does two things. It basically doubles up the intensity of that brush, and also it's very hard to get the symmetry perfect. But sometimes if you get a bit of wobble, it adds a little bit of realism. And what we'll do is we'll get a very large, soft brush and then just soften that away and fade it back into existence. So don't worry that your muscle fibers are fading away. That's all intentional. What we're really looking for is the mass of the muscles. And as you see here, very faintly, as we also squint our eyes, a back is starting to form. So while we're here, we can basically continue with that. We can do these very large winged muscles. If you ever see someone posing, they usually push these forwards. And the way they push those forwards is they bring their scapula out and it sort of pushes their latissimus dorsi, it's called. So we're just going to put those in. Really good one for this is if you use the clay tubes and aim just underneath where the sort of armpit would be. It doesn't have to be a precise incision. Again, we're just trying to create some mass. So I'm going to brush in that direction and then lead it all the way back into around the center of the spine, where a lot of power comes in from posture and structure. So once that's been inserted, I'm just again going to hold soften or smooth and then have that fade back into existence. So if you want, we can have this trapeze just overlap a bit. It's the bottom section of the kite, if you imagine. And so I'm going to again brush in this direction, and I can see that they're attaching to the scapula, and thankfully we've sort of drawn that landmark in, and then we can fade it back in. So that's a reasonable start for a back. Maybe there's some additional areas we can do. For example, a very complicated area with people that they find is this sort of section. So for this, what we're going to do is basically make this kind of shape. So it's all the way to the end of the trapeze up here, and then it's going to fall just short behind the back of the shoulder, or the back of the deltoid, or the rear deltoid, I want to call it. And usually what I do is I'll just invert that again with control and then click off to the canvas, and then we can just insert some information. So with clay tubes, I'm going to do two brush strokes like this, maybe a little bit small for it is now, but what we can do is we can move it after. I'm going to do 2 incisions, going to create this natural center line, going to unmask it, and then I'm again just going to let it melt back into the model. So later on, when we do additional passes, we can come back and sort of refine this and make sure that it looks like our references, maybe make it a little bit tighter and things like that, but we don't want to focus on that just yet. We want to get everything in. So you do have to sacrifice a bit. You just have to leave things in an unfinished state, but that's totally fine. So moving on to the front of the chest, the first thing I want to do is make sure that we're working with a good multiple angles. So from the top, that can sometimes be abused. Luckily, we did the clavicle really early, so we've got that nice shape. There's a good reference here that's showing the bow shape we were talking about, and also the shape of the chest. So for our chest, what we've got here, it's maybe poking out a little bit far. So we just want to flatten that. So we've got a bit of a flat front, and then it curves over. So with each one of the reference you see, you can interpret it and you'll get more accurate and more accurate. Another thing we can observe is that the pectorals go back before they turn into the deltoid. And so what we can do is just pull this back so our deltoid area isn't so big, and then we can draw on top of that. For this stage, what I'd like to do as well is put another landmark in, which is more of a bony landmark, and that's your rib cage. So again, if you're leaning back, that's going to protrude, and if you're leaning forwards, obviously your abs are going to come out and it's going to be all hidden. So the torso is quite complicated because it's a mixture of tenderness, muscle, fat and fiber. But quite simply, what we're going to do is we're going to try and imagine that there's a rib cage under there. So the best way to do that is get something like a dam standard, and then with a very big brush we can lightly indicate the shape of that rib cage. So the rib cage is going to go all the way up to something called the sternum. So you see this blue area is the part that I'm masking there, and that's where all the fibers of the pectoral attach to. But for this, we just want to prove that it exists underneath all that skin and muscle. So again, we can just fade that back. So you can enhance that a little bit. You can go back over it with maybe like a clay. So these poke out a little bit more. So we've got a bit more of a rib flare here. And if you want to get fancy with it, you can do some additional ribs. Obviously, if it's a low fat percentage person, you can insert them. But do remember that not every single one of them is going to show. So be a bit more artistic with it. See your reference and then interpret it from there. But usually what I do is I'll get a dam standard and draw this bowing shape. And that's going to define and finish the rib cage. Might be an idea just to double check from different angles that you like the scale and the shape of that rib cage. So for me, I'm just going to pull it back slightly so it's more rounded, more three-dimensional. And when you pull it back, what you usually find is that the pectoral has this nice little gap where it's opened up. So sometimes what you can do is actually mask the front of the pectoral with control. And then what we can do is we can tuck this rib cage back under. And that's usually quite a nice effect because the rib cage doesn't flare all the way out towards the sides of the shoulders. They're actually really far in. They close. For example, if we're looking at the rib cage, it's going to have this sort of shape, and it's going back in and then going up towards to hold the structure for the neck and the center of the spine. So we don't want it kind of like flaring out here. So what we're going to do is push it all the way back. So that's the main thing that I'm basically looking at right now. Okay, so we can tuck that shape in. Eventually what's happening here, it's squishing a bit of the back, but we can come back to that in a later date. So once that's done, we can do a little bit more of the torso. So all the belly components, including the abs. So it's going to be a mixture of fat and also muscle. Usually what I'd like to do is get a very big clay brush and just do some indications downwards. It's going to create this natural barrel. Maybe if they're musculature, you're going to have more of a split down the center, for example, around where the belly button is. If it's a fatter character, usually there's a little bit of more of a bulky fat deposit down here, so you can insert that. Just look at your references and then take it from there. Every time you do it, just soften it back so we can see where the landmarks are. So what we also have with the character just above the hip are the obliques and the flanks. Basically what you use to twist and rotate and stabilize your spine side to side. So before I do that, I just want to make a bit of space so I can insert those, because this area was looking a bit small. It might be that the rib cage is dropping too much. So we can work all that out by looking at the references. You'll see that we haven't actually looked at many references. One thing I have noticed with this shape is the tops of the collarbone are coming out a little bit too much. So what I'm trying to achieve with this sort of angle, with the rib cage and all the pectorals, is more of an arched shape like this. So this is going to be our lovely stomach area. We can have our rib cage, but again, the rib cage is wanting to go inwards. So we're going to push all this clay back towards itself, so it's resting on top. Okay, so for that, what I'm going to do, very important where I'm aiming, I'm actually going to aim towards the end of the clavicle. So you can see as I move my brush here on the right side of the model, you'll see a little red dot zooming around. And that's really useful to understand where you're actually moving the model. So what I'm going to do here is feather it in very slightly, push it down. You'll probably see a normal human being at this angle. They don't have this sort of like flaring out like that. It's more inwards and a flat chest near the top that's adhering to the rib cage. So that's a bit of a better structure. Obviously it's caved in a teeny tiny bit here, but again, we can just go back over and brush in the direction of the muscle just to repair that. Now what that's done is actually created a new opportunity that you'll often see on the front. So just as the pectoral that we were drawing and also the deltoid that we're yet to insert, there's this empty space in the middle where there are no muscles. It's usually just like nerves and more major veins and stuff. But what that creates is this sort of empty chasm. It's a little bit of a triangle. So what that's going to do is going to separate the pectoral from the clavicle and also the deltoid. And what it does, it gives that really nice effect. So don't be scared to go super deep into this one. So from a distance, it's going to look nice and realistic. And as we're on the center of the body, the front of the neck is annoying me slightly. And the reason for that is because we've got these nice long muscles that lead from the front of the neck that attach to the clavicle. So here, they're going to terminate towards the top of the head up here. So every muscle has a start and end point on their incisions, and it's your job just to fill in that in between bit. So let's see if we can get a better image for that. So you can see that muscle interpretation here. This is a very good posture of a character. You see the front of the clavicle insertion up towards where we're aiming, eventually what would be the skull. And on some other references, we can also see the front shape. So it's kind of got this arching from the center all the way to the outer head. So with that taken into mind, we're going to complete that muscle. And for this, again, I'm going to use a clay tube and just brush in that direction. And you'll see what it does. It wraps around that cylindrical shape we did, and then it's going to connect to the clavicle. And then again, once that's been inserted, I just like to soften it back into existence, and we can come back and refine this at a later date. And so usually what it means is coming in a little bit deeper with something like a dam standard, just to separate this area away from the neck and away from the collarbone. You can also take it from different angles. So from the side, the neck seems to be falling backwards a bit. If we look at a couple of other references, it's more of a fronted angle, especially if you've got like an Adam's apple. So I'm just going to take the top of this and pull it forwards. And that's a little bit more accurate with this reference. With this reference, we can also see that it's a little bit flatter on the top of the chest. So while we're here, we can just tuck that in. And now we're getting, with every single movement, closer and closer to correct anatomy. We haven't even done the shoulders yet, or even the arms, but just showing you how you sort of like can interpret these references for yourself. What I'm also going to do, which is a nice effect, is just split the pectoral muscle. So with the pectoral muscle, you can actually see it on this muscly character who's got a very low fat percentage. It's kind of split into two sections, is the lower section and the upper section. So the lower section is defined by the area that's basically connecting to the center of the sternum there. And the upper portion is the part that's connecting to the clavicle up here. So what we're going to do is just split that with a dam standard and draw a straight line all the way to the corner. And you can see now we've got some more splits. With really athletic characters, sometimes that's split again. If you look at the bottom area, we can sometimes draw a bit more of a split. But I wouldn't go too crazy with this. Again, just like feather it out just so it fades back. Okay, so while we're at this stage, you're probably furious to get a deltoid in and an arm in. But we can do everything one step at a time and make sure there's a really good opportunity that we can do underneath the arm and also do all these muscles that interact with the rib cage. So before I put the deltoid or the arm in, what I usually like to do, and it makes a big difference for games if you're doing rigging and also the realism when it comes to sculpting, you just get a dam standard and draw in the armpit. Make that nice and deep. And when you do that, it's actually shaping that top of the rib cage that's leading back into the top of the torso. So that's a really nice effect if you come in deep before you put in the arm. And once you put in that incision, what it's going to happen is it's going to define the lat, this big winged muscle, a little bit more. So what we can do is just bulk that up a little bit, and that's actually more accurate to how the connection goes into the upper arm. So it's how you pull your arms down or do basically like a pull up, these very large muscles. So that interaction is looking good for the surface of the skin. What you usually find is it gets a little bit more bulky. So you can do an effect called cross hatching, whereas you just go opposite to the muscle. What it's going to do is going to pull it out and round it up a little bit more. Now for anime fans, you obviously have these really intricate muscles that sometimes pop out, and it's called the serratus muscles. So in the reference here, they're actually attached all the way to the ribs and they lie underneath the pectoral, so this big muscle. However, you can only see a couple of them, and it also depends on how muscly the person is. So usually what I do is I draw about 3 or 4 or 2, it depends. And the direction is important because it goes all the way back down to the main torso. So again, I don't like to be too religious about this. So what I'll do is I'll get a clay brush and do 1, 2, 3. And I just go over that a couple of times with the clay brush. And then after, what you can, if you want to get a little bit more fancy, is corner these off with a triangle. So a simple triangle like that. And what these do is lead back into the ribcage area and some other muscles around there. So what we can get is from this triangle is just lead them outwards. And again, they're going in a direction, they're not connecting to anything just yet because we're going to smooth that all out. What we're mainly interested in is the form. So once that's done, I'm just going to zoom out, and then with a very light touch to the soften, I'm going to fade that all and melt it back into the model. So you're going to repeat this process, putting in the landmarks, repositioning them, softening it, and you'll be on a good track for creating a good character there. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up the neck a tiny bit. Just insert somewhat of a little Adam's apple there, and also redefine the trap that we have here. So with the trap, that's actually creating the front silhouette. We want to have a nice little angle here and usually have the neck straight from the front view, just so it's nice and squared off. You can see its cylindrical shape from the top, so sometimes it's useful to actually shape it from different angles. And I usually like to get this triangulated area. You can see me masking it here, and just push it down and inwards, because there's not too many things there. There's just like tendons and it's supporting the neck structure. Okay, while we're here, might as well put in some nipples. This is quite an easy one. Just take the center, aim it sort of towards the outer along the serratus as well, and then you can put it on the corner there. If you want to, you can put a little bit more definition on the pec for additional detail, so we don't have this like perfect straight line. And get damn standard and just hatch it a couple of times. And that gives the effect of bone attaching to muscle. So we can go underneath like this and just really separate it from the main body and the main torso. Now this is a good effect because this is just basically a tendon that's not attached to the rib cage. It's floating almost like a bridge. So we can already insert that right now. Okay, next we're going to do the deltoids. So for this, I'm just going to use the clay. I'll show you the power of how you can just drag some clay out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate around the ball, and as I'm rotating around the ball, you see I'm brushing down with downward stroke. What that's doing is creating this kind of orb structure. So with the shoulder or the deltoid, really nice thing to do is create a bit of a shelf. So all the way from the clavicle, the bow structure we do, we're just going to do one more incision just here, and that's going to define the edge of the deltoid and what we could say is the top of the neck. And then this actually continues all the way back to the scapular bone we did. We're just going to be a little bit more faint here. So the line we're doing, just so you know for your reference, we're basically drawing on top of this bone. And with this bone we can see, it's unfortunately he's putting his arm up, but on the right side you can see the angle of that and also how this is resting on top. So it's just continuation of that. Okay, once that's done, you usually get a bit of a trim and then just flatten the top side there. And then from here we can create this radish shape or this taper that you classically see with a deltoid. So what I do for this is to get a move. I'm going to take the tip and just drag it like that. And that's going to create our nice natural shape. So first we made this nice spherical shape, and then we got a very small bit of clay and just pinched it out like this. If you want to take that even further, you could even use the pinch brush and then just stroke downwards, and it's like pinching dough of a pizza or something like that. So it does have a direction. So once that's in, we can separate it a little bit more from the rest of the body. So with the dam standard, I'm just going to go around the front side. So obviously if this is a muscly character, that would be more defined. And I'm also going to separate it slightly from the back side. I'm going to do one line slightly underneath the armpit, but I'm going to have it fade off into softness, and we'll sort that out a bit later. Okay, so with the deltoid, this is usually quite a good reference. We have 3 sections or segments to it. So there's the front side, and you'll note where the connection is connecting to about 1/3 of this clavicle, you know, this long bone that we did. So from there we can redefine the front one. So we do a couple of clay tubes. Now just in between that we can go back to the dam standard, draw another line, and that's going to split the front one away. And then roughly mirrored back on the other side, we can do a split down the middle, and that's going to separate the back side and the middle side. And you'll see that there's a lot of pixelization here and the geometry is kind of breaking, but I'm totally okay with that because I don't want the details. It's actually quite nice to be constrained by the sort of geometry you have. So when we soften it, it basically like vanishes away. So as I'm looking at the character from this distance, I can see that the back is coming out a little bit too much, probably because we added so much clay to latissimus dorsi. So if you imagine a character looking from this angle, it probably doesn't go that far back unless they're crunching forwards. So before I put the arm in, really good opportunity to get a really big brush, move brush, and then bring that back in. And in fact, we can put more of a natural arch because the spine is supported by an arch. So we have a flat section on the front, the upper back, the one that you put against the wall. And then we have with the lower back a bit more of a natural arch. So I insert it as I see it, and I also want to bring back the belly because this is being extended a little bit too much in terms of the size of the character. So I'm just thinning him out a bit before I put the arms in, so it's a bit more reproportioned. Also what's missing for my liking is just some flanks. So we're going to take it from the bottom of this pelvis shape that we took. I'm going to brush quite broadly in a direction up and towards near the back, but we're going to have this fade out. Now depending on the character, sometimes you can bulk it up a little bit more on the sides, and that's going to give a nice effect. And so the larger the torso is more like a classic Grecian look that you'd see with sculptures, and it's going to fade back up into the towards the back. And then with this we can just reproportion things with the move brush. So use your references for that. So next what we're going to do is move on to the arms. So for the arms, what I'm going to do, I'm using a brush called Insert Multi-Mesh. So with the Insert Multi-Mesh, I've added this to my hotkeys and my custom UI. So if you want to download that, there's actually a video for that, and it's also in the welcome package. So with the IMM brush, I like to use a capsule. So with drawing a capsule out, what it's going to insert is this kind of pill form. It's masked the main body, and with the move tool, we can actually reposition this. So if I hold Alt on the tip and then drag all the way to the bottom, that means it's going to put the pivot point towards the top. And then this is going to almost act like our arm joint. So first what I'm going to do is actually pinch it slightly because we're going to turn this into a bicep and a tricep. So it's a bit like the look of a chain. So once I insert that, I can roughly position it, and I know that I'm going to attach the deltoid back onto this arm. So with the deltoid, you'll see there's a little dot here. That basically indicates where all these muscles are going to and connecting on the bone. So right now we just have it hovering, and then when we put the arm in, we're going to have it connect all the way down. So roughly what I'm aiming is for the arm to spawn from this direction, for a game's character a little bit open, so there's nice space underneath the armpit, so we can do things like retopology and animation, and also make sure it's positioned well. So if the shoulders are back, then usually the arm comes back as well, usually in line with something like the ear is a good rough estimate. So once that's in, you can resize it with the move tool, because again it's still masked, so we can get a rough shape, maybe insert more of like a tricep angle up here, like the upper arm. Just make sure it's tucked in nicely into all the muscles. So once that's done, I'm going to hold control and unmask everything, and then as this is one subtool, because we use the IMM insert primitive, I'm going to come down to geometry. We have Dynamesh selected, and I'm going to re-Dynamesh by drawing a mask square. You can see everything's melted into each other. So this stage, what I'm actually going to do is just insert a little bit more resolution because we're working with some more clay. So maybe put this to about 100 and 120. Re-Dynamesh, and then that's what we're working with. So this, I'm just going to soften the deltoid back onto the arm like this, again just by holding shift, and just have everything fade back. We can bulk up the back of the arm, so that's where the tricep is. You'll see there's a slight indicator here. It's 3 muscles that basically connect towards near the bottom of the elbow. But I already have an arm video, so I won't go too in depth, but quite simply for you guys, it's going to involve clay and then just bulking this up slightly and maybe flattening it. Always remember to go on the inside of the arm, basically the underneath, and then just bulk that up and make it more rounded, just so we get some more musculature here. So with the bicep, sometimes the mistake people make is they bring it out like it's been flexed, but as it is, as we inserted it, it's actually quite accurate. It's more like a cylindrical shape. So I'm going to leave it like that. The only difference here is I'm going to get all these tendinous areas and just push them in a little bit closer to the main body. So what we've got is more of a deltoid that goes on top of everything else. The bicep tucks in quite neatly underneath. So a good tactic for this is if we get a mask, I'm going to mask the upper side of the pectoral, mask the deltoid here, and then I'm going to get a big move brush and I'm going to push this up and in, and that's just going to have a nice, more realistic anatomical look to it. So the interaction's a bit better there. So at this stage, we've got the main landmarks in. We're just sort of like smashing them in and not looking at too many references. This stage we can start to just refine it. So for the clavicle, I like to go a little bit more deep, and then it's just about using the dam standard to redefine any musculature. Remember, you don't have to follow the entire muscle. You can just pick and choose certain areas to go in quite deeply, and then it gives a nice effect. So for example, on the front, we can just go and indicate a bit more rib cage for that section. Or maybe we want the rib cage to poke out a little bit more there. We can do 1 or 2 incisions. For the abs, we can bring a bit more definition back. So we can get something like the clay tubes and then draw 1, 2, 3. And everyone's abs are going to be different. If you wanted to bulk that up, maybe you could get a dam standard and then just lightly fade over it, or reinsert the belly button here, for example. Maybe we can bring out the flanks a little bit more. So there's a nice S shape, basically separates the front abs. And you'll see that when I do incisions, I don't do straight lines. I basically zigzag it depending on where the muscle is. And I'm going to lead this all the way back up, and it's going to split the bottom side of the body away from the rib cage. It's going to give sort of a nice effect there. Another useful one is we could insert a little bit more bony landmarks. So we look at the shape of the rib cage and where that's basically directed. We can start to insert a couple of those, just some very simple dam standard ones. For me, this neck is a little bit thick, so the neck length here is almost about 80% of the width of the body. So obviously that's not very correct. So what I can do is just pull this backwards. That's got a more realistic effect. The next stage, which would be really good, is to actually add the head in there, and that's going to give us some nice proportions. But as this is more of a torso study or something that you would practice with, you can basically form it from there. So just on the back, what we can do is up in here, we've got a bit more of an opening where it comes to some of the spinal segments. So instead of splitting it, we're just going to open it up slightly, and then we're going to insert about 2 little dots here. That's going to give a nice effect for the bone, and then we can just soften it away. Look at the shape of the muscles, and we can just reintroduce anything that's been lost as we've been sculpting. So it's just a case of repositioning stuff, making it fade back into existence, and then re-going over it again. Towards the lower back, this gets a little bit deeper, so usually I go quite hard with a dam standard, and then also lead another dam standard, which is going to define almost the bottom of the lat, and have that fade off. This is all pinched together, so you can use something like a pinch tool, and then just draw in this direction, and it's going to give us a good setup for creating the lower hip and the upper section of the glutes that we eventually put in there. If you want to bring back the realism, you will just look at wherever there's a bone incision and just try and insert that a little bit more. So for example, the sternum, I can flatten that and just define it with something like a standard brush. Just brings it out slightly more, adds to that realism. And finally, I want you to remember that nothing's set in stone, so we can just start to reposition this, give a different vibe to the character, maybe make them less broad, less bulky, get them older, reduce their fat. So it all starts from here, and then you can make your changes and adapt it as you want. Maybe save this off and make a different version of a character and things like that. If you want any of these materials and all the resources that I'm sending out in terms of how to make game characters or want to get in the industry, definitely follow the email list. And also when it comes to the torso, remember that we're not creating these Attack on Titan looking things with all this musculature. Not many people look like this, and often they're airbrushed or are crunching in a very particular way to enhance their muscles. So think about scans and how normal people look. They have sort of like flabby skin that creates these weird shapes. So when it comes to creating realism, what we'll be doing is just fading away your muscles and then just trying to interpret the softness of the skin and the surface. So for example, this guy has a lot of fat and skin that's building around the lat and going up to the shoulder blade. So maybe you can insert that with yourself with a clay brush, just to be a bit more anatomically correct. Okay guys, so thanks for watching, and hopefully we can make some more anatomical videos. I might do a more in-depth version of this for people on the membership list. Just a very quick video that you can watch to see the more intricate versions of the anatomy. But hopefully that helped, and I'll catch you on the next one.